Alright, so I got the transmission mounted on the bench. First thing I'm going to do is take the torque converter out of it. The torque converter is still inside the bell housing. So I'm going to take this off. Then I'm going to take the bell housing off. The bell housing is secured to the case. This is the case. It's secured to the case by a series of bolts inside the bell housing. So this whole piece will come off, and this is actually the parting line between the case and the transmission. So this will be gone, and then I'll come over here, and we'll take the transmission to transfer case adapter off, and then I'll tip the transmission up, and I will take the transmission pan off of it. We'll see how much fluid is in there and what is inside this transmission. Okay, so I put a couple bolts in the front of the torque converter to help me lift it out of there. I have my drain pan under it, and I have this old flex plate sitting on top of a bucket that I'd like to use to drain the torque converter. So once the torque converter's out, I'm going to put it in the hole in the flywheel, and that'll drain it into the bucket. Okay, so the torque converter's out now, and we can see the turbine shaft here. We see the turbine shaft seal right here, this O-ring. This will have to come off to be able to get the pump off, because the pump won't clear the turbine shaft O-ring, so we'll have to take that off. The turbine shaft, also called the input shaft, is what splines to the turbine inside the torque converter. This is the stator shaft, and it splines to the stator inside the torque converter. Okay, and on these bell housing bolts, they're actually a special design. The Torx head isn't a regular Torx, it's a Torx Plus, which means the flutes in there aren't sharp like on a regular Torx, they're kind of rounded. So don't use a regular Torx bit in there, you have to buy a Torx Plus. And here is what happens when your Torx bit strips out the Torx head. I was actually using a Torx Plus too, which is kind of irritating, but my air chisel made short work of this bolt. Okay, so I wanted to show you something else on this. See, we have the output shaft here. This is the output shaft, and then there's no seal in here. This is the output shaft, and then we have, if you look, you can just see the output shaft bushing just peeking out down there. This is a wet chamber back here, so fluid, as it lubricates that bushing, the fluid hits the bushing and squeezes out, and as it does, it runs back to the transmission pan through this little passage right here. That goes into the pan. Okay? So when you take this, when you take the adapter off and the transfer case off, there's gonna be some fluid in there. All right, now we got the transfer case adapter is off, and then we got the transfer case adapter and the square cut seal. Okay. See, it's square cut. So as you can see, I have the torque converter housing off. I have the transfer case adapter is off, and the oil pan is off. You can see all the solenoids in there. You can see the fluid pressure manifold, fluid pressure switch manifold. You can see all the stuff in there, the valve body, all that good stuff. So the next step is going to be taking the valve body off. Once the valve body is off, I'll remove the pump. There's two things that you want to remember when you're doing these. A lot of guys like to leave the valve body on the transmission and then take the pump out. I really don't have a preference. Usually I take the valve body off because I can't stand not having the valve body off and knowing what's going on in there. But if you're taking the pump off first, there's two things you want to remember. One is you can't get it off until you take the turbine shaft O-ring off, because the pump won't pass over that O-ring without damaging it. You'd really have to force it to get it off past that seal. The other thing you want to remember is that this solenoid, the torque converter clutch apply valve, needs to come out, because that's actually in the pump. So if you take all the bolts out of the pump body, all these bolts, remove the O-ring, and then start prying on the pump, you're going to break this solenoid. So you have to take this solenoid out first. So we're going to take the connector off of the pressure control solenoid. There's a little lock back here. It's right there. And what we're going to do is we're going to push the lock away from the solenoid and then pull the connector. And hopefully it comes off without breaking. Okay, that's it. And the next thing we're going to do, we can't get the torque converter solenoid out without removing this valve here. So in order to do that, there's a little retainer clip in here. See if I can rotate it to get it to move up. Okay, so it just came up into view in the slot. It's right there. You see it moving? So we're going to take the screwdriver, we're going to clip it under the back of that clip. We're going to keep it from shooting out and wailing us in the eye because it really wants to. And then we're going to lift the clip out of there. And then we can pull the solenoid out. And you want to be careful because some of these solenoids have springs on them that will push the valves out of the transmission when you release the lock. Okay? So now we have the solenoid out and we have the retainer. So we got all the bolts out of the valve body, and as you can see, they're all in different lengths. Some of them have 10mm heads, like these, okay, and some of them have 8mm heads like these. So you want to make sure that you keep track of them. These are the longer bolts that have 8mm heads. These are the 10s. Okay, so you want to make sure you keep track of these bolts so that you can give them back in the right place. There is actually a bulletin that was released a while back about putting the wrong length bolts into one of these holes. It was actually this hole right there. If you put the longer bolt in there, it would actually run right into one of the components that was spinning inside the transmission. I'll show you which one later. But it would have to actually jam right into that and lock it in the housing so the transmission wouldn't turn. So anyway, you want to keep track of these bolts. Don't mix them up, and put them back in the right holes. We got the valve body off. It's laying on the bench, upside down. You can see we have the manual valve here, and as I move it, you can, if you look into the ports, you can see how it directs fluid through the valve body. Okay. All right, and then over here we got this. We have the spacer plate with all the check balls in it, and notice this one is not beat into the spacer plate. Okay, so that's a good thing. And then down here we have this is the spacer plate support bracket, and we'll take that out. And then we have the park mechanism here. This is the bracket for it. That's the rod that runs up to the manual valve, and as we rotate this, it pushes the valve into, or pushes the shaft into the park pawl down there. You can see it moving in and out of park. Okay. The spacer plate's off, and we can see all the holes where the check balls sat, all the orifices, and you can see that most of them are beat up from the check balls hitting them over the course of several 100,000 miles. So anyway, the other thing I wanted to show you is that there are screens built onto the well, attached to the spacer plate, and these screens are designed to catch debris and keep it from going into specific passages inside the valve body. So that one's got a little bit of debris in it. There's another one over here. Take that. It looks like there's a tiny bit of debris in there. Okay. And then one thing you want to remember, not only is there check balls on the top of the spacer plate, but there's also check balls under the spacer plate. We have one right here, right in that port. Although this one, if you look at it really closely, see if I can get some light in here. That one, as you can see, is actually captured. So that check ball will not come out of the housing. Alright? But over here, we have another check ball that's inside the housing under the spacer plate, and this one you have to remove when you're building the transmission. If you tip the transmission up, it'll obviously fall out and you'll lose it. And then if we look here in this area, we can see the piston and the return spring for the 3-4 accumulator. Okay, so this is a 3-4 accumulator, and that is 1-2 accumulator, and this one just has the piston that you can see inside. You can hear it is the spring. So we're looking at the park assembly again, the parking mechanism. See the rod, and it's got the spring with the actuator on the end. We see I got this bracket loose, and I'll pull it out, and now you can see this is the park pawl. Okay, as this rod, let's see, as this rod pushes against it, once it gets to that little ridge, it pushes the park pawl into the gear, and down there is the gear. So I rotate it, see the gears going by. That little square on the end of it will push into that gear and lock it in place. The cool thing about this mechanism is that spring right there. So if you shift your car into park and that gear down here hasn't rotated far enough for the pawl to lock down into one of the teeth, what happens is the rod still moves. You're still able to shift the transmission into park, but what happens is this will wedge against that pawl and be pushed back until the car rolls forward enough to lock the pawl into the gear, and then it'll be pushed back down where it belongs, forcing the pawl into the gear. Now we see the turbine shaft with the O-ring, and I'm gonna push the O-ring to one side of the shaft so I can get my pocket screwdriver under it, and then I'm gonna guide it out of the slot that it's in. Your overhaul kit would typically have a new one of these, so even if you just wanted to cut it, it wouldn't matter because you'd have a new one in the kit. Okay, if you do cut it, you want to make sure you don't cut or damage the land that the O-ring sits in. This thing's fairly hard. It's almost like plastic now instead of rubber. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to show you was the bolts that go in the housing, or go in the pump that hold it to the case. They have O-rings on them, and you can see there's a machine surface in there to hold the O-ring, and you can see all these O-rings are flat because they've been in this transmission for 1.5 million miles. So when you rebuild these, the aftermarket kits will come with new O-rings. You just pull the old ones off and put the new ones on. If you buy your kit or buy your bolts from GM, if you try and buy those O-rings from GM, they only come serviced with the bolts, so you have to buy the bolts. Alright, so now we got the pump out. It's laying on the bench. It's actually upside down. That's where the stator attaches. You can see the O-ring that runs around the diameter of the pump, and we can see the seal that we use for the fluid filter. And then we have the other side of the stator shaft, and it's got 2 Teflon sealing rings in there. Okay. And then we look in the case, you can see this is the gasket that seals the passages into and out of the pump. And we're gonna pull that out of there. Hopefully it comes off in one piece without breaking. These can be kind of a pain to remove. It tore, but they came out in one piece, so we're good. And then we have this little hoo-ha in there, which is the thrust washer that keeps the this drum from smashing into the back of the pump. And if you look at the stator shaft, you see a pinhole there and a hole there. That bushing goes on there just like that.